I started a series a couple weeks ago just called the IFs of Jesus. There's a ton of them. And today is like the third part. But the first week was on the Sermon on the Mount when he says, "You are the salt of the earth." And then he follows it with an if the salt loses its flavor. Talked about a lot of different things, but I guess the main thing, there's two things to pull out of that first one. Every if that Jesus gives us is always a connection, and even the ifs that we use. An if is a connection to something that's unknown. So when you say if, there's an unknown attached to it. So when we think of the ifs of Jesus, as far as I'm concerned, we're looking at that revelation that says Jesus gives us an if, then he gives us a connection to something that's unknown. And you are the salt of the earth. He starts with the revelation. He's not going to tell them they're the salt of the earth if that's what they know. He tells them something that they don't know, that nobody's ever told them before. So he starts with a revelation because he knows it's revelation that continues to build relationship. I feel absolutely very, very, very sorry for anybody who feels like they've got this full revelation of Jesus and God. That they haven't changed almost daily, to be honest with you, because that's the way relationships are. You keep getting more and more revealed. You come into more of a revelation, and that's where the relationship kind of grows, is in the ongoing revelation, if you would. So he's saying they're the salt of the earth, but then he gives them an if that says, if the salt of the earth loses its flavor, how can it regain its saltiness? The second word I want to hold on to is restoration. Because we look at it like, oh, well, so if you lose your saltiness, well, it's not what he said. He was asking a question. If you lose your saltiness, how are you going to get it back? It's like with men, it's impossible. But with me, I'm the restorer. That's not in the verse, but he ends with this question, how do you get the saltiness back? If you don't, then you're good for nothing. You get thrown in the path on that whole thing. So we walked away from the first one with the connection to the unknown, which means there's revelation involved, but Jesus is always bringing restoration in the revelation. It's not a matter of just saying, oh, we talked about this. Isn't that cool? I'm not sure we're supposed to be going, isn't that cool? I think probably that's what Pharisees and scribes do. Isn't that cool? And that's as far as it ever goes. It never really gets worked out or lived out in people's lives. It's never walked out. It just becomes really cool, Last week we were in the last if in John 21 when Jesus says to Peter, if I will that he remains until I come back, what is that to you? And I likened it to spiritual maturity. As far as I'm concerned, spiritual maturity is a matter of the wills. Like Paul talks about, is our will is being conformed to his. That's what spiritual maturity is about. When he says to Peter, when you were younger, you did what you wanted to do. Yay! But when you're older, you're going to start to walk in a way that you're not crazy about, but you will walk in that way. It's a nice way of saying to Peter, you're going to be spiritually mature, and you're going to have worked through your will. My will be done instead of thy will be done. So spiritual maturity is that growth, that process that takes place that he's telling Peter about, that the battle of the wills will be over. Ours will have been conformed, and you'll just be walking with me. The key word being with. When he says, follow me to Peter, it's not like walk behind me, it's walk with me. We can walk this thing out. It's about as beautiful a representation as almost like a bride and a groom, that they're walking together with each other. One's not walking in front of we're walking this thing out together. Both of those ifs have to do with now. You're the salt of the earth now. Be the salt, and we talked about that. And when he says follow me, that's a present tense verb. Follow me, not tomorrow, but ongoing right now. So that's the ifs where we have been. And today we're going to be in Mark 9. There's an if that we're going to get to, but it's going to be quite a ways down here because I think we need to take, like we did with John 21, we need to take the chapter a bit to set the stage of this particular if. Mark 9 is the chapter where Mark is referring to the Mount of Transfiguration. We're not going to go through the whole Mount of Transfiguration. There's only two things I want to come off the mountain with. Once they had seen Moses and Elijah, once you get the whole story of the Mount of Transfiguration, it says, as things are winding down, that they saw no one anymore, but only Jesus with themselves. I kind of feel like basically this is where the Holy Spirit's trying to lead the church. There's a situation where we just don't see anything anymore. Just Jesus. Only Jesus. I think all the other stuff that has really screwed us up and it's really hampered our spiritual growth is because we're tied up in a lot of things, whether they're doctrines and theology. And this experience that they had on the mountaintop, what they were left with after a mountaintop experience was only Jesus. And I like that. Now, that's not to say anything about the church and all that. It is to say that once we put everything else aside, all we've got is only Jesus. Now we need to hold on to that because what's going to follow ties into that. The way Mark is writing this, and all the gospel writers, they write in such a way that they're making these connections for us. There's nothing wrong with isolating the Mount of Transfiguration and preaching about the Mount of Transfiguration. The leading of the Spirit in their writing was always more than just taking these isolated incidences, if you would. Also, when the Father speaks on the Mount of Transfiguration, it's different than the baptism. He says, "This is my beloved Son," but he also says, "Hear him." Cut through it all. All they see is Jesus. Yeah, all you should be listening to is Jesus. Hear him. See him, hear him. See him, hear him, see him. Whatever, any way you want to do it. This becomes crucial because you don't live on mountaintops. You don't live in the middle of hallelujah and the chorus. We don't live in the middle of that. We need that in order to get into the valley, which is where they're headed. Mountaintop experiences are crucial to the valley experience, but we don't live on the mountaintops. Jesus has come out. We're going down into the valley. He leads them back down into this town where our if is going to take place. Would you read Mark 9, verses 10 and 11? They're coming down off the mountain.
And they seized upon that statement, discussing with one another what rising from the dead might mean.
The statement they're talking about, Jesus had told them, that he's going to be rising from the dead, but don't tell anybody.
And they asked him, saying, "Why is it that the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" And he said to them, "Elijah does first come and restore all things."
They raised this thing about the scribes and the Pharisees have been teaching us that Elijah is going to come first. You're talking about, rising from the dead. You could see where the guys, in all due respect, the guys are a little bit confused about eschatology and what's going on here. The thing is this, they've just seen Elijah, the one that the scribes have been talking about. The scribes have been talking about basically Malachi, the end of the Old Testament, when it talks about the spirit of Elijah returning, restoring the hearts of the fathers to the son, that whole thing. So they had their teaching down pat about the return of the spirit of Elijah, and it doesn't seem to be lining up with their experience, the disciples' experience. In other words, I've been taught this, but it doesn't seem like that's what's going on here. What's going on? Now, you guys may or may not, maybe your whole spiritual lives, everything you've been taught has been lining up just perfectly. If you have, I'd be amazed. Because most likely what's happened is our teachings are happening, and they're not bad teachings or they're wrong or whatever, but things just don't seem to be lining up. And that's where these guys are at. Things just don't seem to be lining up here. I guess what I want to say is this. The scribes had been really good teachers at teaching Malachi about the spirit of Elijah. And Jesus is going to go on to say in verses 12 and 13 that the spirit of Elijah has been here on John the Baptist. So the bottom line is this. You've got the scribes and the Pharisees, the scribes in this particular case, the scribes doing a teaching about the spirit of Elijah who's right in front of them and they don't recognize him. It's relative to the one where the Pharisees are standing face to face with Jesus and and they're talking about God and he's like, "Well, I'm right here, hello," and they don't recognize him. I'm not trying to put down scribes and Pharisees. What I'm talking about is there's a big difference between head knowledge, which I believe the Pharisees and the scribes had, and knowing him. These guys, the disciples, Jesus is trying to engage them in actually knowing the Son of Man, knowing the spirit of Elijah, not just having a good teaching, but they're coming down off the mountain. They ask him about Elijah. Would you read verses 12 and 13 now, the whole thing?
And he said to them, "Elijah does first come and restore all things. And yet, how is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I say to you that Elijah has indeed come, and they did to him whatever they wished, just as it is written of him."
So they ask him a question about Elijah based on the scribe's teaching. Jesus says that Elijah has come, is coming first. But it's almost like he's saying, isn't it interesting that the Son of Man is going to be crucified? The spirit of restoration of all things is here, as well as the Son of Man. We're present, and religion just doesn't recognize us. Isn't that odd? So in their questioning of him about Elijah, he throws back a question. Isn't this an odd situation we've got with these great, Bible studies that nobody sees? It's kind of interesting what he's just talking with them as they're coming down into the town. But he makes a statement about the restoration of how many things? All things. Now, that's not like two words, all things. It's one word. Panta. It's one word that means everything. Elijah has come, and he has been the vehicle by which the door is open for everything right now. Everything. This is what Jesus said, what do you want? Because it's all available. It's everything. Now, in the context of himself, he says, the Son of Man shall suffer many things. So he's referring to many things. He's referring to all things. There are many things in the context of all things. Every one of us in here will suffer many things. But in the context of all things, this is the if that we're going to be getting to. If you can believe, all things are available. They're all possible. Get it out of your head and heart that anything can't happen. In fact, you should be in the exact opposite place, that the door is wide open to everything. It's, you know, when Paul keeps saying repeatedly, all things are yours. And we go, well, I don't have a Mercedes. And no. Who the heck would want a Mercedes when you saw everything, the wholeness, the fullness, the restoration of all things, all joy, all comfort, all peace, all goodness, all relationships, all wholes, everything that we possibly would hope and dream in our relationships, in our families, for our kids, all the different, it's all available, all of it. It's all yours. And Jesus is saying, let me show you what I mean. Because he knows where they're going. They're going down into the valley. See, the valley is where we live. We don't live on the mountaintop. We live in the valley. The valley of decision is what Joel calls it. Where the rubber meets the road, if you would. We have the invitation to the mountaintop. And we need the mountaintop if we're going to hear him, if we're going to hear the Father tell us. Hear him, listen to him. Did you hear what he said? All things are yours. All things. Did you hear him? Listen to him. Listen to him. We need that mountaintop. Because without the mountaintop, the valley can be a place of dry bones. It can be really, really dry down there. It's the valley of faith where the challenges of life are. It's the reality. It's the realization that all things, the restoration of all things, but I'm going to tell you what, right now in front of me, I don't see that. What I see is a man suffering. I see a woman in pain. I see families destroyed. And Jesus is saying, yes, but the restoration of all things is here.